In every age, value is more than numbers. It is a mirror of the human soul. Before he became a thunderclap in political thought, Karl Marx was simply a restless young man in a quiet German town. A son, a student, a poet in the making, searching for the fracture line between what is and what ought to be. He did not begin with revolution. He began with questions. He was born on May 5, 1818, in Trier, a provincial city in the Rhineland, where vineyards crept up the hills and Roman ruins reminded citizens that empires rise, then pass into stone. His father, Heinrich, was a lawyer trained in the Enlightenment tradition. Pragmatic, rational, convinced that reason could prune injustice like a gardener pruning a vine. His mother, Henriette, was warm and worldly. The home had books, conversation, and argument. But the age itself was unquiet. The steam engine hissed. Machines drew workers from fields to factories. Towns swelled. Wages fell, rose, fell again. A new word settled in the streets like soot: capital. Another rose in answer: misery. Marx left Trier for the University of Bonn, then Berlin, a city of ideas where Hegel's shadow still strode the lecture halls. There he encountered a generation of thinkers called young Hegelians, who believed that criticism was not just a pastime but a duty. To think clearly was to pull the mask off falsehood. Philosophy, for Marx, became a crowbar. He would use it to pry up floorboards and ask who built the house and on what ground it stood. He learned a dangerous habit: following a concept to its consequences. If history moves through conflict, he asked, what is the conflict of our time? If ideas shape institutions, who funds the ideas? And if law speaks for the people, who writes the script? His first career was not underground, it was in print. As editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, Marx grew impatient with censorship and the polite fictions of power. He investigated forest laws that punished the poor for gathering fallen wood, and tariffs that guarded privilege while declaring themselves guardians of the common good. He discovered something Adam Smith had warned in a different register: when policy can be bought, truth is priced out of the market. The state censored, the paper was shut down. Marx left Germany for Paris. Exile became a workshop. In cafés, he met artisans, radicals, and a man who would become his intellectual partner and benefactor: Friedrich Engels, the industrialist's son, who walked the factory floor and wrote about what he saw: child labor, cramped rooms, the quicksand of irregular wages. If Smith had mapped the virtues and vices of markets as neighbors to the state, Marx now proposed to redraw the whole neighborhood. He called his method critique, not to sneer, but to strip illusions from reality. Begin with the ordinary: a coat, a loaf of bread, a worker's day. Who made the coat? Who owns the loom? Why does the owner profit more from the day than the person who lived it? He studied value, not as price on a tag, but as human effort frozen in things. He watched how cash moved like a river and how wages, like tributaries, returned again and again to their source. Here, the moral question sharpened. If a worker sells labor for less than the full value it creates, who keeps the remainder? He named it surplus value, the margin that becomes profit, capital's invisible harvest. To Marx, this was not a clever accounting trick, but a social relation written in ledgers, power deciding the price of life's hours. And yet, Marx was not a miser of compassion nor an enemy of intelligence. He admired ingenuity, the ability to turn a gear and multiply output. What he could not accept was dependency dressed as freedom. If the choice for many was work on the terms offered or do not eat, then choice itself, he argued, had been cornered by necessity. In Brussels and Paris, he and Engels wrote a short, incendiary text, the Communist Manifesto. Its sentences marched like soldiers. A specter is haunting Europe. The document announced not a blueprint, but a diagnosis. Society divided into classes, the few who command capital and the many who sell time. It predicted convulsions, crises born of overproduction and underconsumption, and it promised a world where property in the means of production would be common and exploitation, as he defined it, would cease. But manifestos do not pay rent. Revolutions fizzled. Doors closed. States took names. Marx moved to London and found poverty instead of power. Soho rooms, pawned coats, illness stalking the family. He wrote by candlelight and buried children. History's arrows look neat on a chalkboard. In life, they are drawn with tears. In that darkness, he wrote his longest light. Capital. Das Kapital. Volume 1 appeared in 1867. It is a story told with equations and parables, diagrams and indictments. It lingers on the factory floor, the rhythm of shifts, the elasticity of hours, the way a machine can command a human day without raising its voice. It asks, if profit requires a gap between what labor gives and what labor gets back, can a system depending on that gap call itself just? To many, Marx was a scourge. To others, a prophet. To his friends, he was a relentless mind, a man who loved laughter and footnotes with equal energy. To his critics, he mistook complexity for law. He reduced the variety of human motives to hunger and power. But even his enemies admitted his courage. He would follow an idea to the last consequence, even if it meant exile, poverty, or scandal. What, then, is the moral heart of Marx's first act? Not the fantasy of leveling, nor the worship of the state. Rather, this: a refusal to call necessity freedom, and a demand that the story of wealth include the soul of the person who earned it. He saw in the worker's day a kind of sacrament, hours offered to the world, and he despised any arrangement that made those hours invisible. This is where Marx and Smith meet, not as caricatures, but as neighbors at the fence. Smith feared the visible hand of privilege tipping the market's scale. Marx feared the invisible command of capital turning free exchange into trained reflex. Smith built a city of limited government to secure honest trade. Marx demanded we inspect the foundations. Do the bricks, the contracts, the norms, the bargaining power rest on fairness or on custom hardened into law? Austrian voices, generations later, Mises, Hayek, and others, would warn that the state cannot compute the dispersed knowledge that markets carry in their prices. Marx would respond from another angle. If prices carry knowledge, whose knowledge do they carry when bargaining power is unequal? The friction between these claims is not a math problem. It is a moral landscape. It asks, how do we build institutions where dignity and dynamism can share the same street? Marx's genius and his danger was to fuse moral outrage with a scientific tone. He turned sympathy into theory, and theory into a call. But calls echo differently in human hands. Where Marx wrote of emancipation, regimes later built prisons. Where he imagined councils, bureaucracies rose like fortresses. Where he accused markets of alienation, some successors alienated whole nations from themselves. So what remains if we read him not as a script, but as a mirror?
3 provocations.
Then, first, value has a biography. Every price tag hides a story of design, of labor, of bargaining, of risk. Markets coordinate these stories brilliantly, but they do not absolve us of asking whether any chapter was coerced or concealed. Second, power concentrates. Whether in ministries or monopolies, privilege tends to seek shelter. We need rules that keep doors open, competition where possible, transparency where necessary, humility always. Third, progress is not identical with accumulation. Wealth can expand. The human circle can shrink. The point is not to slow invention, but to remember why we invent. To enlarge freedom, not only output. In his London years, Marx kept writing, editing, and arguing, with friends, with editors, with history itself. He mapped crises like a cartographer maps storms. He believed that when the weather turns, the ship's design is revealed. He urged the world to ask, who commands the helm? And he warned that a vessel built on inequality will always list to one side, no matter how clever the captain. Yet even a critic is, at last, a human being. He loved his wife, Jenny, who copied his manuscripts by hand. He adored his children and grieved them. He took long walks to soothe a mind that ran too hot. He is easier to debate than to dismiss because he belongs to the family of serious minds, those who risk the comfort of consensus to ask uncomfortable questions. This episode is not an endorsement. It is an invitation to discernment. Marx reminds us that the economy is not a machine but a chorus of lives, and that efficiency without justice can sound like a hymn sung out of tune. Smith reminds us that consent, choice, and entry, the freedoms of the street, are the shields of the poor. Between them lies a path. Institutions designed so that honesty pays and predation costs. Markets defended from privilege. Communities alert to suffering without surrendering to control. If we are to be custodians of value, We must keep asking the questions that begin where numbers end. What kind of person does this system make of us? What kind of neighbor? What kind of nation? This is Masters of Value, the echo of ideas that built our world. Next time, we open the factory door. Marx and the birth of surplus value. How time became a commodity. How machines changed the tempo of life. And why a day's work came to feel both more powerful and more empty. Can a price capture a person's day? And should it?